Um, so thank you again. It's a pleasure to be with you here, albeit virtually. I hope that one day I can actually join you in the flesh. I do find myself in Europe from time to time for family and speaking and other things, but I come to you from sunny California right now, where it's morning time for me. So cheers. So I'm Jessica Groopman. I'm an industry analyst and one of the founding partners with Kaleido Insights. Kaleido is a kaleidoscope. And we analyzed a kaleidoscope of technologies. That's where we got our name. There's a lot of different emerging technologies shaping business and life and society these days. And so we essentially research those and provide advisory services, not just on the discrete kind of vertical technologies, but on how they come together. My background is in anthropology, so I tend to have a kind of human-centric lens to these issues. And in many ways, that's actually what kind of inspired this frame that we'll talk through today, a little bit different from a lot of the current discourse around artificial intelligence and machine learning. So enough about me. What I want to do today is talk through kind of unlearning AI as artificial intelligence and rethinking about it as automated inferencing or inferences. Part of the inspiration, aside from the kind of human-centric, well, what about the human side of the coin here? I've written several reports on artificial intelligence from the business standpoint, from the consumer standpoint, from the kids, actually online safety standpoint. But none was sort of more Herculean than a report that I wrote on 215 use cases for AI across 30 different industries. And so this really kind of pulled me very wide and helped me understand the ways in which AI has many different manifestations and why different, we treat different categories such as advertising differently than, say, in healthcare or the industrial space or whatever. So we'll get into more of that, but I've taken kind of a wide lens view on AI. I also want to look at kind of why it matters, and we'll talk through different implication areas or issue areas. And I definitely want to spend time on these in the panel. But in some ways, these will look familiar as in sort of AI issues and things that we probably have been discussing in this realm lately. But I want to kind of give the lens of why inferences are so key to these issue areas. And then finally, let's have a great discussion. I'm excited for this. Okay. So everyone seems to have their own definition of AI. This is one of the struggles in defining this space, but it's important that we get our arms around this before I, explode it with a different definition. In many ways, AI is an umbrella term. When you talk to technologists, of course, it is concepts and techniques in computer science, where machines demonstrate intelligence. Even though we don't have a very good definition of what intelligence means for humans. There's, mathematical intelligence, emotional intelligence, so on and so forth. This is still something that is debated in the human realm. But we've been using that word to basically show that we are designing machines to mimic us. Machine learning, deep learning, natural language processing, computer vision, machine reasoning. There's actually new techniques that fall under the AI umbrella being developed every single day. Now, this is, you guys have probably seen this, but the basic kind of how the sausage is made when it comes to AI is we feed data, a lot of data, often multivariate data sets into algorithms to develop a model. And then once we have that model and we define the data, we define the parameters ourselves, then the model spits out various options or various outputs, as they're called, or outcomes. These are inferences. And essentially, they are statistical likelihoods. So that's why you see some of the percentages there on the screen. So it's 92% likely that you are going to like this next ad that you see, or that you are going to purchase this color shoes, or whatever the case may be. So that's what we are talking about when we talk about AI on the more technical level, although this is a fairly simplistic overview. But I've always really struggled with this as a definition because it's not something I could explain to my grandmother. And I feel like in the land of emerging technology, we have to keep it accessible. And so, that research that I told you about around the 215 use cases, what we found was that actually a much more accessible way to think about, information systems imitating biological systems is not through spewing out different techniques, but is to say, okay, well, all AI actually falls into one of three categories. We are teaching machines language. So your chatbots, your text analysis, your translation, and many, many other applications that fall into that one category. We're teaching machines to perceive, not perceive like us, but to recognize via sensors heat and what something looks like, and motion and movement, and moving through space, all these different kind of think of drones or autonomous vehicles, or image recognition, emotion recognition, perception. And then finally, a big category around analysis. And all of this is pattern recognition, but this is the kind of catch-all for being able to recognize patterns across many different types of data set. This is often sold in the enterprise environment as sort of bringing light to your big, dark data sets that are not being used today. So on some level, I like this definition because it's a variety of methods and tools that mimic cognitive functions, a little bit less technical. Now, all of that said, there's still a link missing, and that's what I want to talk about today when we talk about, kind of current AI discourse. And that link is connecting the code-based statistical composition with how we humans actually make decisions. Okay, so I'm going to talk through those. So as I just mentioned, machines infer outputs based on the data that we expose those machines to, or those models to, and the parameters that we define. And that output is not an answer. It's not necessarily a truth. It's simply a statistical likelihood. You are X percentage likely that something is going to happen. Now, humans take these inferences and we make decisions based on them. But just because the machine says X is 90% likely or 99% likely does not necessarily mean that it's true. Now, what's critical here is that the output itself is a statistical likelihood, but once we use that output, it becomes a reference. It becomes the reason why a decision was made. And so this is the case for all kinds of machine-generated outputs, whether recommendations, diagnostics, risk scores, worthiness scores, whether or not you have, epilepsy, whatever the case may be. To the extent that this has been talked about is actually typically in the kind of explainable AI realm. That's where this image comes from. This is from DARPA, and they have a kind of big expose on explainable AI. And again, this might remind you of the flow chart I just showed. Data, in this case, brain MRI data, a model which learns off that data and then spits out, says, okay, this patient is diagnosed with epilepsy with an 85% confidence. And, these days, doctors are kind of taking this into consideration. And we might have heard about, the augmented human or the augmented worker, which it's not clear, it depends on the application as to how much they actually use the AI or not. There's a big question around trust and explainability. But I think the critical point here is that we are using inferences as decision-making references. And that's where the connection that we can't forget as we continue to offload decision-making to machines. An AI output is an inference, but the use of that output becomes a reference. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, humans do that too. And it's true. We infer, to some degree, this is not that different from general differences in logic around inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning, or even kind of common refrains in statistics of causation versus correlation. But there's a key difference, and you can think of this as sort of tail and scale. If you think of a distribution chart, say a bell curve, we focus on the center. That's the most common cases. And the ends of that are the tails. Now, humans make mistakes too. And generally speaking, there are definitely exceptions to this. Generally speaking, our human mistakes only impact locally. We can think of counterexamples, but by and large, when a single human makes a mistake, the impact is not on a global scale. And again, we can find counterexamples, but generally speaking, we in society have mechanisms for accountability around our own mistakes. When we discard the tail of how, we don't think in terms of statistical models because we're humans. We make decisions based on 5 or 6 salient features or our own experience. But we have, legal systems, social pressures, relationships. We're very kind of emotion-driven creatures. And so there's several different forms of accountability that are kind of baked into our mistakes or how we go about making decisions or weighing variables. Now, when it comes to machine mistakes, they're still using inferencing like humans. But one, the accountability is very low. For one thing, there's very few laws on the books. We in the United States call this patchwork 2021, which is our current legal situation around AI. But even outside of that, there's a huge disconnect between being able to audit and regulate actual code and process. Even if we have laws on the book, there's nothing that automatically syncs that with how code and models are run. So there's low accountability, not to mention the explainability side of the equation. And then also, when a machine gets it wrong, there can be very, very large scale impacts, especially when we think about the sort of, the big nine or the AI giants and how many different end users, consumers, as well as companies use their AI, their models. So much bigger impacts, a larger scale, but lower accountability. So I wanted to kind of zoom in there on the tail and scale. We both tend to discard the tail, but the scale of impact is potentially much, much higher when it comes to machines getting things wrong. So now I want to provide a couple of different examples, and this actually came from a study around biometric eye tracking and privacy and data protection around that. Now, what you see here is actually what's commonly referred to as one biometric, your eye. But on the left, what you can see is there's several different data points in biometrics that come off your eye. Now, on the right are what we assume, based on the inferences of the model, are references. And you can see, obviously, gender and age, physical health, your cultural background, your ethnic background, your mental health, personality traits, skills, and ability. You all can see on the screen, when inferences become references, we assume that the individuals, whatever those pink labels are, the personality traits, etc., are what the algorithm tells us they are. So I just think this kind of provides a really clean and clear, just the way the technology works. Not good or bad, but this is just what is possible based on eye biometric data. Now, this could seem a little bit far-fetched. Obviously, the last year has been a huge accelerant for biometric tracking, but at the same time, this is very widespread today. What you're looking at here is an image of sort of behavioral inferencing at scale, which we have in all of our online interactions, which are used and bought and sold by advertisers, by political actors, by basically, many different commercial actors. There's the information that we share. There's all of the kind of metadata in IoT device data, which is, what VPN you're using or how your keystrokes actually are, how you actually type things in. And then all of these different inferences on the background, on the outside layer. Now, this is being used to identify everything from, whether you're a beer drinker or a compulsive shopper, to your sexual tendencies, to your religious views, to all kinds of scoring mechanisms, how well you sleep, what your reputation score is. The sky's the limit here in terms of how data is being used, often in ways that are very, very different from the initial kind of intention of, say, if I share a photo on Instagram, how that information, what information can fall off of that, and how that information can then be used. So we're shifting now, or at least what is at scale today, at programmatic scale, is from this behavioral inferencing to what's called digital phenotyping. Now, digital phenotyping is essentially the use of big behavioral and biometric data and IoT data to infer different health conditions. So there's already several studies showing that, again, emojis, keystrokes, your facial features, other biometrics, and all sorts of different things that offer high indication of anxiety, Alzheimer's, your mood, autism, etc., so on and so forth. And, this is to say that as we are shifting with new forms of data, new data sets, new inferences are made possible. Now, I want to get to some of the issue areas here, but I said that, this offers a high indication. But again, we are faced with the burning question of causation versus correlation. And, just to take one example from this digital phenotyping and some of the implications, We've done a lot of work on different demographics, and one of the demographics that we focused on a lot is very elderly populations. Well, you might have elderly folks who are perfectly sound of mind, but maybe they're not so agile on a computer. So they're not necessarily going to use emojis, or maybe they'll only use one emoji, or their keystrokes will be very, slower, generally speaking, than someone who grew up typing quickly on computers. Not necessarily, but only to say that these kinds of tails or non-majority populations are often discarded from this kind of inferencing. And so, you could see very easily that an algorithm could tell you that someone who's 75, because they type very slowly, well, they may be on, the outset of Alzheimer's, but that's not necessarily the case. So why does all of this matter? I'm sure that we can understand that there are some downsides to this as it is, but I want to talk through something like, I think I have 12 or 15 different areas that are often kind of overlooked when we talk about this difference between an inference and how that inference is then used and run with. Now, I want to step back a little bit because when we talk about the AI market and the kind of broader context in which all of this is happening, I've heard it described well as one of FOMO, FUD, and feuds, or fear of missing out, think fantasy, fears, uncertainties, and doubts as companies are racing towards digital transformation and under a lot of competitive pressure to sort of be more and more digital and deploy AI as quickly as possible. And then feuds. I mean, needless to say, AI is one of the sort of geopolitical, core elements of our time. And there's tremendous investment flowing into it from a government standpoint, and a real sort of clockwork to achieving that. And so this sets the stage for how companies, regulators, lawmakers, individuals to some degree are thinking about AI. We all have that sort of, science fiction template perhaps, but there is very much still alive and well today this notion of AI as a flashlight, to find customers that you could never find on your own, or to gain insights into hidden patterns that you've never been able to see before, or to identify criminals who are walking amongst us, threatening our children. All these different, scenarios are sold, but AI is the key to unlocking them. And it's true that AI has predictive value, but this is part of the sort of context when we talk about that space between inference and reference, and how we recognize it or sort of gloss over it just in the interest of actually deploying. Now, when it comes to deploying AI these days, only about a quarter of businesses are fully enabled, which is to say at scale and running AI in production. A lot of companies, I've seen stats in the 80s, 90% are experimenting with it, but only about a quarter are really at scale. And this is for the enterprise space. There's a very big gap between the aspiration and the tales of AI that we are aiming to achieve in the actual execution on the ground. Now, a couple of other data points I think are critical here. 92% of business leaders believe that they can leverage AI to improve decision-making. And this is the core sort of driver here. We are using AI to offload decisions, to reduce the dimensionality of so much data and so much complexity in the world. And already, even with only a quarter having adopted, 9 out of 10 executives say that this is going to be critical, even if they don't have it yet, to leverage AI to improve decision making. And I'm not disagreeing with that, only to say that this is already the starting point for our implementation. Now, another point that I think is very interesting here is that 65% of data and analytics executives, which I think could say are some of the most sophisticated folks in the big data space. These are executives that focus on data and analytics all day long. 65% of them cannot explain how AI model decisions are made or how predictions are made. So again, that big explainability challenge there. And 96% of organizations who are working on AI face a lot of data related problems. That's the big gap between actual execution and aspiration. Now, another issue here is around governance. I probably don't need to tell you all this, but this is, something that is very often focused only on the AI life cycle, the model development life cycle. So where is data coming from? How is it accessed? Who actually has access to it? But there's been much less focus on the purpose for which it's analyzed. There are some, GDPR to some degree mentions intended use case, but when we talk about governance and how we go from inference to actual decision making, there's actually very little focus on this particular area. Who is responsible for making sure it's good, for actually making sure that it's constantly updated and optimized, and actually measuring effects in the first place. There's very little kind of integration for the space between taking what a machine says and trusting it and running with it in the governance conversation and sort of accountability, generally speaking. Transparency and explainability, I already mentioned a little bit. This is kind of the black box issue. Why does the AI generate the output that it does? Why certain data can corrupt models? We still don't understand that. Explainability generally is a UX issue. And so explainability for a data scientist is going to be very different than for an executive, than for a regulator, than for a consumer. This is a huge challenge, not just in deciding whether or not I take the output, the advice of the machine, but how can I even justify it myself? If I'm a call center agent and my customer is saying, well, why didn't I get access to this loan? What am I going to say? So there's a huge trust issues, huge UX issues around understanding, how the sausage is made using AI today. Another is erroneousness, when the model simply gets it wrong. Consequences abound. And this is, I have the example here of a man named Robert Julian Borchak Williams, who was wrongfully accused by an algorithm, essentially pulled into the police station and stripped down, asked all these different questions. He wasn't even at the scene of the crime. It was an error altogether. And this obviously has a kind of smell to it around, digital dragnetting and automated policing and racial bias. But, there are many examples of machines just simply getting it wrong. And part of where we are with AI today is that this bridge between inference and reference has in many ways been glossed over because it didn't really matter that much. When we take an inference and use it as a reference in advertising, or to tell me that I'm going to like the blue shoes more than the red shoes with the white soles or whatever, it doesn't really matter. When we take the inference to recommend this musical artist over that one, it doesn't really matter. But as we shift from advertising into other realms like hiring, like access to capital, like politics, policing, health, erroneousness has a much bigger potential impact. Compliance and auditability is another one. I mentioned this through the standpoint of explainability and being able to actually see and apply regulations or legal protections in the code or in how models work. But this is a huge area, and there's so many different realms of AI that just don't have a clear liability to them at all. And this, by the way, is one of the barriers to business adoption. But there's many different legal implications of AI inferences used for decision making. Now, there's also some interesting opportunities here. I mentioned that we cover, convergence of different technologies. And so, for example, we've seen companies in the financial space who are taking AI generated inferences or outputs and putting a hash on them, adding them to a very sort of internal blockchain, if you like, simply to designate, okay, this was something that came from the AI, to try to essentially put a watermark on something that is AI generated versus not. And it can still be used, but there's still a documentation. So just one small example of, this is a huge challenge for AI generally, whether we're talking about inferences or otherwise. But there are also some interesting kind of opportunities for integration across different technologies. Discrimination and disenfranchisement, this is where finally a lot of the conversation is really starting to expose the diverse exclusionary impacts of AI inferences. And again, sometimes this is erroneous, sometimes it's nefarious, sometimes it's just a function of having no transparency into this. This is a hugely tied not just to hiring and access to capital and education and health, but also to the digital divide generally. I'll give you another example. You may have heard of automated underwriting, which is kind of like underwriting in the past, except where we used to use government issued documents, or that you have purchased a house and paid it off, or a car and paid it off. Now companies are using what's called automated underwriting, which is pulling your digital footprint, your big data footprint, how often you pay for your Netflix, all of your online subscriptions. It's using kind of big, more modern social e-commerce digital data to assess your credit worthiness. Now, a lot of people say, well, this is actually great for folks who ordinarily wouldn't have access to financial system, accounting, whatever, or who wouldn't have access to a loan in the first place. But again, remember, I mentioned that we've done a lot of work with the elderly population. These are folks who don't have a digital footprint. So even when we have an opportunity such as automated underwriting, which can seemingly increase access, in this case, to capital, there are other ways where ignoring the tail actually has a huge impact on the scale of populations who more and more need access to capital more than ever, older folks. So there's all kinds of two sides of the same coin when we talk about AI discrimination and disenfranchisement based on some of these inferences. Another area is around human vulnerabilities. I mean, I probably don't need to tell you all this. We've seen that AI, this is the media's favorite AI article. A new study says that AI can predict your political orientation. AI can predict your mood from the way that you walk. AI can predict your sexual orientation. Anything that is perceived as a vulnerability is used as a bias for decision making, is used to manipulate humans. This is sort of our current crisis around the use of our data against us in ways that we can't even actually see or control at all. Now, another thing that's interesting about inferencing here as it's used for references is that we don't actually need your data, or your data might actually be more useful for someone else. Data is often used today to fill in the gaps about another person or another opportunity. When inferences are used to fill in missing data without any transparency or verification model. So we might know this as, people like you are shopping for this, or people like you often buy that. The likelihood that a person will do something is sold as this person has this categorization. So the likelihood that you will vote for a Democrat is sold as you're a Democratic voter. Now, again, that's a clear example of this difference between inference and reference being absolutely lost in translation. It becomes part of our digital identity. Now, this is one of the ways in which technology giants have a huge advantage. Aside from their massive compute power, their massive data makes it so that they actually, if you turn off a lot of your settings, that's okay, because plenty of people like you, or perceived to be like you, or maybe over 80, 90% like you, have not. And so there's this kind of question of, it's not just in our control. This is, the refrain that privacy is public. And this is one of the reasons why that is so. Another area kind of related to that, I call it digital Frankensteins, right? This idea that there are incomplete or incorrect or simply outdated labels about individuals, or for that matter, business assets. This is not just about humans. But it has a lot of implications around how our digital profiles may or may not be used against us. But this is an issue. Do we as individuals have the right to know about categorizations that are being used about us? This has everything to do with our agency around our own data, with the economic power of data itself, and how that is sort of being clenched rather than distributed. Because these Frankensteins may or may not, they're sort of digital ragdolls. They're fragmented versions of ourselves defined by other entities. There are human safety implications here. This is an example of a robot that it says that it went rogue, but really, something went wrong with the code. It ended up smashing glass and it injured a man. And there are tons of examples of this in the IoT space, needless to say, as well as in sort of deep fakes, a lot of scenarios around, what would happen if the machine got it wrong, but it's too late because the humans have already acted. human safety, dangers, costs, liability, health implications around medical devices, all sorts of different things that actually potentially could impact our physical safety. Business reputation. Companies are often afraid of AI through the lens of trust. And what is interesting here, I offer two examples. One is from the North Face, a retailer who is just dipping their toes into using IBM's Watson. And this is actually a rare example of a company saying, hey, we're using AI to help you find this perfect jacket. That's what we're doing. Most companies don't do that at all. Now, on the other side of the coin, when we think about reputation, is Facebook, who tends to throw technology at every problem. And so it wasn't a surprise at all when they introduced fairness flow to try to address their horrific ethical issues in their own AI by simply building an AI to identify those issues. But business reputation, impacts can go in all directions. And again, how good is the AI? How strong is the use of the inferences, the trust in those inferences? This is a core area for branding, for reputation today. I always think that it's somehow a little ironic that there's been so much push around purpose of organizations as of late, as we are trying to grapple with AI and the purpose of actually implementing AI. I could talk more about that. Another issue area is that this is, a question around the future of work. As people increasingly come online or come to make their decisions at work using AI, what does that mean for future workforces? Right now, we're in this hybrid space in so many ways when it comes to work. But as our next generation workforces start day one of work using AI tools, what does that mean? There's some implications there around decision-making, around transparency, around how enterprises build knowledge, not information, but knowledge. Information asymmetry. I mentioned this a minute ago, but when inferencing is used to further big data assets of the tech giants, exert monopolistic power over competitors or individuals, or for that matter, not a commercial entity, but a government, authoritarian control over what the truth actually is, because the truth is what our AI says that it is. There's a lot of kind of elements of information asymmetry. This is seeping into many parts of our world today. I'm sorry, I couldn't help but just put this image in the slide. I thought it was hilarious, but it's a great example of one of these vast companies who is collecting more and more first party, second party, third party metadata, device data, network analysis data around and around and around to advance, their commercial ends. Now, another side of this is sort of the culture of data, in that we have today the tools and the data for machine learning are more readily advanced by private industry and commercial entities than they are by traditional academic research institutions. So again, that proprietary, closed walled garden competitive instinct driving AI as a space versus a more open, a more about learning, science, generally speaking, culture around academic data and research institution data. There's some exceptions on both sides of those, but that's part of this information asymmetry, is sort of who is advancing AI generally. Now, part of this as well is that we're at kind of the beginning of this curve. I talked about that we're shifting, or expanding from behavioral inferencing into biometric inferencing or environmental inferencing. But what will we be able to infer with neurometric data, with genomic data, with the triangulation across all these different data sets? Who controls? And again, as we are shifting from low impact areas in, say, advertising to higher impact areas around health or access or politics or anything else, the stakes are fundamentally higher. Now, the final area that I think is really key and sort of the crux of the truth about us, as this presentation is titled, is taxation on AI knowledge. In other words, as we are continuing to build theoryless knowledge, to start with observations and build theories that we don't understand necessarily because we can't see into how the model is generating those outputs, those theories about the case. This accrues what Jonathan Zittrain at Harvard calls intellectual debt. We just simply don't know how it works. Now, we have some instances of this in pharmaceutical, say. We don't know how all drugs necessarily work, but they work. And so there's good impact there. So we use them. But increasingly, we are expanding these sort of black boxes, or when we talk about multiple AI interacting with one another, what we call Frankenstein systems. Think social media or the financial system, these big, huge macro systems that are constantly interacting with each other that no one truly understands or can see into. We are accruing intellectual debt. It's not just a linear process, right? We're not just producing inferences once. Those inferences themselves are fed into other machine learning models. That's what we mean by AI interactions and feedback loops. And then, of course, when we sort of attain artificial generalized intelligence, AGI, and this kind of religiosity around data, which is sometimes called dataism, this is lingering in the background of what do we actually know. These systems are not in isolation. They're constantly evolving in ways that we just simply, as humans, do not have the capacity to fully understand. This quote, I think, sums it up well. Financial debt shifts control from borrower to lender and from future to past. Mounting intellectual debt may shift control too. A world of knowledge without understanding becomes a world without discernible cause and effect, in which we grow dependent on our digital concierge to tell us what to do and when. And that's again by Jonathan Zittrain, the co-founder of Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Institute and Society. So I have a couple of summary points. One is simply that inferencing is not the same as intelligence. And it's really important that we discern between the two. And in many ways, this being able to discern between what the machine tells us and what actually is the truth, or what actually is the basis for decision-making, underlies key tensions around centralization of data, of power, of AI generally, of transparency and accountability, and of inequity. Who is designing the systems? Who is ignoring the tail on this distribution curve, so to speak? So this is a core area that we have to pay attention to in all matters of AI and its implementation. As I probably don't need to tell you that augmented decision-making or augmented inferencing is permeating everything. Every industry, every world government is focused on this, and there are many opportunities. This may have been a little bit of a bummer, but obviously, all of this is tied up into not just risks, but opportunities and safeguards. And one of the things that makes it so difficult to get a grasp around this is that different applications have different implications. I mentioned advertising versus, health diagnostics, but this is true in every single realm. Application specific is one of the reasons this is so difficult to safeguard. Finally, this is fundamentally redefining our relationship to truth. The more we rely on big data, the more we rely on AI to reduce that dimensionality, and ignoring the tails also threatens risk at scale. So thank you. I am looking forward to a discussion. As they say, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. So maybe we can unpack that a little bit more.
That's a nice ending. Thank you so much, Jessica. That was a good end slide. Let me first ask for the audience if there's any questions. I think it's, well, we wait for someone from the audience. I think it's good that in the end you also emphasize that there are also a lot of opportunities.
Of course.
Because I was getting a bit depressed about the Frankenstein world we're developing towards. But you did make clear that it's very hard to use AI for good. Because even if we wanted to use it for good, we are still raising inequality, for example, for people who don't have an online profile, who don't have a digital footprint. So it's very hard, but I don't think you are one that would say, let's forbid AI in general. Not that
I mean, no, of course not. And it's true that I probably didn't offer as balanced a depiction of the benefits of AI as I should have, or as is fair to do, because, I mean, one of the interesting selling points for AI and drivers of investment is that this does put more tools into more hands. I mean, take remote patient care, for example. Not everyone has access to the best and the sort of most resourced healthcare opportunities or clinics or studies or research or whatever. And so, the mobile device in many ways becomes a way of extending that access outwards to remote populations who, thanks to the image recognition on their phone, are able to actually see that they have an issue. It's a huge driver of preventative care. So, I mean, just one example, and it's often sold as a kind of tool for democratization. And in many ways it can be. It is, both of these things are true, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that you're looking from both perspectives. But of course, we asked you to highlight the risk. So I think, let me introduce the panel. I asked you all to also introduce yourself for around 5 minutes and reflect on the story of Jessica before we start a discussion, but also feel free to react to one another. And also all the other listeners, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. And I might ask you also to join the discussion if you want to as well, if you feel like it. Mick, you are first in my screen. Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Oh, wow, big screen. Okay, hi everybody.
Yes.
My name is,
yeah. Sorry. No, I'm just thinking that I asked, thank Jessica enough, but I'll do it in the end again. Thank Jessica.
Yeah, my name is Mick. I'm a design researcher. I've worked in digital innovation for the past few years, and now I work as a marketing teacher in Rotterdam. Yeah, I always was a little bit negative about AI, I would say. So I'm still trying to come to grasp with the positivity of it and the positive implications of it. On the side, I do lead the Speculative Futures chapter. It's a global chapters around the world. And I lead the Amsterdam chapter. And they actually gave me a lot of input for new meetups and new topics to explore, including the word which I will butcher now, erroneousness. Like I will definitely look into that a little bit more. So yeah, no, I think from this talk I took a lot of stuff away from it. Like, oh, this is actually, like, I never really thought about that. So I also had the question, which we can pick up in the panel as well, like where should education start with this, right? Because if you think about the future workforce, what's more important, like knowing the data set or knowing the model, or knowing that we should actually question, and we can also say no to the output, be like, oh no, I'll take my 8% chance, like. So I think that's really interesting to just see. So that's basically my reflection and my introduction, I think.
Let me just add, because you were also in a program that was looking for ways to, as I call it, corrupt facial recognition.
Yeah.
Which was also a really good initiative. And if you look at the story Jessica shared with us, do you think there is a market for purposely corrupting certain applications, certain inferences?
Yeah, I would love to say so, obviously, but I also came to the sort of conclusion that, like, well, we are kind of then in this hybrid phase, right? AI is coming to us, and we basically have to deal with all the negative things it will have and all the mistakes it will make, and we kind of have to frame ourselves like, okay, what are we going to do? Do we want to really say like, okay, we're just not ready as a society, and let's just not do it for now, and let's postpone it for, I don't know, 50 years, 100 years, or should we technically embrace the process and just be like, okay, apparently we're the guinea pig generation, we just have to go through it, and at the same time then really share the responsibility to make that AI as optimized as possible.
Yeah, I mean, and to your point around trying to corrupt these systems like a facial recognition, I actually think there's tremendous value in these kinds of intentional corruptions. It's like white hat hacking, right? There's a huge role for that to, well-intending companies who don't know using their own resources, or they outsource. We want to know what is weak about our whatever infrastructure topology. And so to have groups and skill sets that can do that for good, or for resilience, for security, is crucial. And I mean, even like perturbation in models where you're just trying to screw something up, this is part of making it stronger, right? We don't want our autonomous vehicles to run off the road every time a woman walking a bike, which is what happened, you know, when a car actually ran into someone. It was because it couldn't decide between a bike rider or a pedestrian because the woman was walking, but she had a bike. And so that happened to be a corruption to the model. But, you know, we need to be trying to poke holes in these things to make them better.
Yeah.
Super, thank you. Iskander.
Yes. Okay. And you want me to share my screen? I think.
Only if you want to. You can just.
No, I'm just kidding. No, I like that. I like that. No, I was just thinking. Thank you, Jessica, for all the extents. I wrote down a lot of things, and for me, yeah. There was one thing. As an introduction, I think. I do a lot of things, and one of the main things that I'm doing now is looking into this research into cities of things, where we started at Delft in the university, but really looking in how we're going to live together with these intelligent things. And that was one of the things that listening to your talk and thinking about how AI now was really, or looks more like almost like a touch point on data. There's one way getting sense of data, and I'm really interested in, and also that's what we really looking into, in a kind of a way that we not only having AI like in that sense, but that we're not only thinking about understanding these data, or that we indeed has this inferences, but that we really, the things has also their own intentions almost, or at least grow into a kind of a different relation with us. And that's one of the interesting things that I'm interested in, and what will happen when these things become more intelligent in a sense that we maybe see also intelligence, and what does that do with the way that we relate to them? Who is responsible for certain decisions? And in the governance part, there's a lot of things to say about that. Are we always saying that the human has the priority in the system, or have we kind of democratic systems where we delegate certain rules to the system of things? I don't say that we have to do that, but these are the interesting questions, I think. So yeah, that's a bit what I'm also looking for. And I was discussing this today with someone that was really looking into AI and design, and about do you want to show stuff of an AI system? Does that make sense? In the relation you have, or in the quality of the interface. And I think it's really interesting how we can use insights in how the machine is making decisions in the end, to come to a better understanding of both ways, so to say. So that's what we often also say. We have the concept of co-performance, where you say it's not only about using technology as a tool, but trying to find a shared goal, and try to find a way that we use both powers of both qualities of human and technology in reaching that goal in a kind of a co-performance, shared goal kind of way. And these kind of things are really, I think, an interesting aspect to look at AI also. Maybe I leave it with that now, otherwise I'm talking too long.
Reflecting on the presentation, Iskander,
Well, that was my reflection was that I see a lot of.
I have a question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Because we could use design to make the inferences more transparent and allow for negotiations, as Mick was calling it. Do you have or know any examples of AI in which this is done and the user really has some agency also in negotiating with the system?
Yeah, I'm not always a bad one for. I will think about it a little bit later and put it in the chat.
Just
maybe Lorna has some good ideas.
Oh, let's go to Lorna then.
You know,
Did you stop sharing? Oh, sorry, Jessica.
Yeah, I stopped
sharing.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, of course, I will do that.
Thanks for sharing this. I really like the dilemmas for design. I think these are some of the core tensions. So to reply, Manon, to something you just said, what I think is interesting is that sometimes end users are used for training models. Like you might be accustomed to getting something that's like, how is this recommendation? Was this relevant to you? But that's the end of the negotiation. And I always think there's so much opportunity there to sort of have a few more rounds. And there's also there's sales opportunities there too. But, you know, there's one step that's being taken. Was this relevant to you? Well, what if it wasn't? Or, you know, you could build a whole kind of design paradigm around that, individually personalized. But I also haven't seen any real sort of participatory negotiation beyond that myself.
No, I'm not thinking. I have a student now working on a vacuum robot that has more autonomy and has more predictive knowledge, and will try, in a discussion they have, try to choose the right level of autonomy. Should how much initiative should that robot, the vacuum cleaner, take in a situation, and by starting this discussion. And that's a really interesting project, I think, to see how we will relate to these kind of systems. That's a real life thing that's happening now. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Lorna has the answer.
Lorna, maybe you can add
Great, thanks. I sort of loved the presentation. I mean, you actually covered probably so many topics that we could have an hour discussion just on each one of the slides. I think it was just like a sort of an amazing aerial view of so many of the issues. I was like, oh yeah, that one. But actually, beforehand, I sort of captured a few little sort of thoughts, and it was really encouraging to see how that kind of match very much with a lot of your story. I've just got a couple of slides. Also, I think it's interesting because I can introduce myself as someone who's incredibly biased. I'm also someone who has multiple identities. And I think this is also a kind of characteristic that we maybe tend not to take enough into consideration. So I'm just seeing if that's going to work. Says I can see this loading thing, or is it?
It's working, I think. You should
We can see you, but we see your slides, not the presentation mode.
You can.
Okay, I can't see that. Let's go full screen. Okay. So when I talk about my multiple identities, so one of my identities is actually, this is a foundation that I'm involved in, and I think it's quite nicely related because it's actually looking into rethinking the paradigm of identity. By actually looking at Toolkit for Decentralized Identity. Also, one of my other identities is working more closely in the user experience, user interface world. And there I've actually been involved in looking into a parallel kind of customer journey for an AI engine, for the compliance journey. So looking for AI from the point of view of the a conversational AI from the beginning, where actually inference is made, where conclusions and decisions are made, and where there is also regulatory requirements. So it's very interesting to see how there is a sort of a parallel journey that actually AI needs to be addressed with, I think, when you're actually designing for it. So it's an interesting part of my identity. Let's see if that works. So one of the things I think that comes out a lot more, and it's coming out with you. So we've had this sort of like statement that we sort of picked up about data quantity. That's where we're getting the value from. And AI is very much, I think, driven. And you showed about these big organizations that are somehow getting more and more of the data, and they are getting more quantity and maybe more intelligence. I would like to challenge that or raise the question, is that really the case? Or is there another mode whereby higher quality, maybe less data, can actually give better results and better inference? It's the question. And it comes down also to the framing, and you touched on this as well, of course, I mean, it's the intelligent. Why do we call it artificial intelligence? Isn't it anything but intelligent? And you highlighted the language, perception, analysis. Why are we calling this intelligence? Is it a high indication of, again, you said, according to whom? And this is also very, very dangerous framing, I think, because if you think of how we are in the world culturally, how we assess and value certain types of intelligence, whether we have emotional intelligence or, which intelligence are we talking about, and what impact can that have on individual society? So it's, is it actually an issue of framing? And I think there's a lovely article I can recommend people to have a look at it. Hopefully you can sort of find it from that link. But it's a discussion indeed about how we frame things will actually affect how we perceive it and how we actually eventually will interact with it. So if we're framing artificial intelligence as being this being that's maybe better than us, and I think that's the risk that we're running, we need to maybe bring that down a step or two. And in this discussion about, data isn't oil, what is it? Here he's sort of looking at this data is actually our lives. So imagine instead of saying, I want your data, it's like, I want to take your life and give it to someone else. We might actually react differently to how we let these systems work with us. And so actually the language we're using is maybe something we also need to address, a question. Another thing, together with Iskander this last year, we've actually run a number of really interesting workshops, just looking at principles and frameworks and actually sort of building trusting technology. So I pulled up a couple of things from there. I think they're probably very familiar, but there's amazing work being done. I think Australia's got an amazing overview as well of principles and frameworks for AI. But in our discussions, I would raise the question, is that actually working? I don't know whether it is. And also because they're looking at ethics, and actually we need to actually understand what is ethics, what is it there for, how does it connect to morality, and how does it connect to regulation? We hear the answer so often, I wasn't breaking the law, but was I actually behaving in a moral way? Was I actually being ethical? Bearing in mind that morals is culturally, socioculturally embedded. So do they work, the principles and frameworks? And if they don't work, why not? And I think another discussion, probably also familiar, this book that Kate Crawford brought out, is shifting again the discussion from ethics and regulation to the power dynamics. And I think you also touched on it very much in the presentation. So we've got things that are happening, judgments being made, decision. We've got inclusion or exclusion, the opposite, of course. And we've got like gross manipulation. I think anyone who's seen the documentaries of the Great Hack, for example, Cambridge Analytica. And then underneath that, explainability and accountability. You also highlighted that for some reason in the human physical world, we have that much better embedded than we do in this new artificial intelligence world. And I think just the statement that Kate Crawford says, who is actually benefiting and who is harmed by this AI system? Bearing in mind, it can be put in many, many, many different situations. And so there, I think my final point is sort of reflecting on that is we're seeing most of the damage caused by and to individuals. I'm questioning this because it's not really, the field that you think you're more deep into that. So I'd like to bounce that back in you. But what if we had, in the early days of this is an amazing tool. I'm also very much pro the possible value of artificial intelligence if it's actually implemented well. But if it's actually put to societal issues or institutional or the commercial one we have to be very careful with, rather than actually making judgments, decisions, and exclusions and inclusion and manipulating individuals. Could that actually be maybe a way to balance the damage that's happening. I think that's where I'd like to sort of maybe throw those questions out there about the framing, the naming, and the power balance.
Super. Jessica, do you want to react on that?
I mean, I thought, you captured it very well. The who benefits and who harmed is everything. And, I mean, languages too, right? And, as you said, how can we reframe the word data, which really doesn't mean much, even for those who work in, in and with data. I think this is really brilliant. Yeah, no, that's great. I'm looking forward to more.
Okay.
Thank you, Lorna. I'm also working on a digital trust infrastructure for the Netherlands, and I joined a morality workshop meant to discuss values that are contradicting in a certain application. And what I learned most in regard to your questions, do principles and framework work or why not, is that we often start by choosing a certain tech as a solution, and then start with ethical principles and how should we design it. And the beauty of this workshop was that it emphasized, first you should start with the question, is technology even the answer for this complex problem? And that's where you should start the morality, the ethics discussion. I see you nodding, Agnes, so if you want to take the floor, yes, please. I saw your writing as well, so really.
Oh, yes. Can you all hear me correctly?
I hear you. I don't know if you can be closer to the microphone.
Yeah. I'll move a little bit closer and I'll project my voice a little bit more.
Okay, super.
All right. Well, thank you, first of all, Jessica, for such an interesting presentation. I have been writing because I'm going to tweak my chapter based on this. So tonight I'm here wearing my hat as a researcher. I am a PhD researcher in intelligence and national security at both the Romanian Intelligence Academy as well as the University of Malta. And the reason why I'm kind of here and how this interacts with what I do is that I look at AI and machine learning in intelligence, particularly when it comes to identification of persons. So I really started off with sort of the journey, from facial recognition to everything that's sort of gone beyond that. But there's a couple of things I want to pick up on. One of the things is the debate that just came up on, why do we even call it intelligence? And that's interesting because intelligence in my field is a very different definition of what does it mean? It means contextualizing information, right? It's not smartness per se, or sometimes how we like to equate AI. So one of the things that I've been really looking at, and that really came back in this discussion as well, is the issue of bias. And I think it's important to underscore that humans are always biased. It's not just the machine, but as you said, there's this scalability problem. And we try to solve that sort of by putting a human in the loop and saying, well, as long as we have a human or a human on the loop, or as long as we have a human involved, that should sort of solve the problem. But of course, you do get into that debate that we had earlier about, do you have the autonomy to really question the output you're presented with? And the design of that, of course, comes in. And this is where I wanted to bring up one of the things on one of the issues that I have, because the design is often also biased. And I did see a question come up, be like, okay, well, how can you, how can you build in bias and recognize it? My plea to everyone would be, make sure that your teams are as diverse as humanly possible, because there has been some research, and I haven't been deep diving in this, so maybe it's an outlier, but there has been some research to indicate that women, generally speaking, are less inclined to question a suggestion than men are. So if we're designing a user interface to let people actually take some sort of agency in questioning an output of a machine, should we take that information into consideration in how we design that? Let me see. I did want to briefly put, highlight, because Manon was a little bit disappointed almost. There was almost no mention of, what is great about AI. And I do think there is definitely a role for AI to do sort of more with less, particularly in a government where there's always this drive to cut on costs. But, you need to have a bottom line where you say these tasks cannot be done, at least not autonomously, by a machine. I am of the opinion, as far as I've done my research, that this is a security context, obviously, but once you have a ground truth that you can know, you might be able to use artificial intelligence. For example, if we're talking computer vision and you'd like to identify a car, as Jessica said, with the autonomous vehicle, it doesn't always go right. If you have a bicycle and a person walking that, the machine might not always get it right, but eventually there's a ground truth to know. This is a person walking a bicycle. It gets really, really murky, and I think it gets towards dodgy science once people start to know or claim to know the emotion you're detecting based on your facial recognition. Yet there's plenty of technology out there that's being sold as such. And one of the interesting conversations I had was actually at a trade fair where I was talking to a gentleman about this software, and he said, well, it's 60% accurate in identifying the emotion of a person. I was like, well, that's great, but if I'm working with people that are, that have orders shoot to kill, that's never going to cut it. And it's just slightly better than tossing up a coin. And he's like, nobody ever compared it to a coin flip to me. And that's, for me, that's really troubling, because these are the people that are selling this technology to law enforcement, intelligence, security agencies. And I also think there definitely needs to be some education on that side on the purchasing side. And that's not something we've really come across in this discussion. To what degree are people in charge of procurement actually aware of what a machine can or cannot do? And so that's, I'll end on that. I'm sure there's loads more to talk about, and thanks again, Jessica, for a great presentation.
Well, thank you. I mean, you just reeled off several very interesting threads as well. The one I want to talk about purchasing for a second, because someone else brought up education. And I think that this is often when we talk about education for kind of AI governance and risk mitigation, it's like kids or in the education sector. But I completely, I agree that the actual buyers of this technology, be they data analytics executives or not, or any business practitioner or government, military, whatever, that's another core area of education. And so, yeah, I mean, to tie that to the question of, are the principles working? This is part of the integration of the actual humans implementing, overseeing, discussing, communicating about these systems. It can't just be about, their sort of efficiencies or their performance, gains or whatever, but a more broader context. And yeah, I appreciate, that's true that intelligence in your field has a completely different realm. And perhaps if we rethink, AI through the lens of context building, this is actually much more productive than the squishy word of intelligence. So thanks, that was really good.
I was also thinking from what you said, Agnes, on the research about women less inclined to question suggestions. And for me also a puzzle is, because I'm also working with it, how can we make people aware of the dilemmas when they share data and know what they share. But this offers an extra complexity. So I don't know if Mick or Iskander or Lorna or one of you want to react. How are these aspects taken into account? And is design the solution for educating people, or should there be more to make people aware? Or can we solve it through design? I don't know, Mick, your...
Yeah, no, it's like just based on this, I think there's a thought in my head now that, like, if we do not call it artificial intelligence, right, and we would just call it, well, something else, and then that is like what Matt Locke said, right? Like, if data isn't oil, then what is it? Then we're already kind of in this loop that we refer to it as artificial intelligence, and we should already work back to what we actually want to call it. So if that is inferences or anything like that, then that's the first step, I would think. Then first change the lexicon, I would say, until we start refiguring a whole new method where we should deal with it. Like, I think the first thing is the metaphor or the terminology that we use to do it. I think that might be just the first thing to actually tackle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lorna, is this a solution?
Yeah, no, maybe to add that as well, I think it is very much as a framing challenge. And also, if you think of, I saw a presentation a couple of years ago from Kevin Kelly, and he outlines as well that, we've got this umbrella term for multiple ways of inferring or concluding or getting some kind of insight out of data. And it's very, very monolithic a lot of the time. So you've got one form of machine learning that's used for one particular purpose, and you cannot then take it over and use it for another one. And if we start thinking of it in that way, that for each purpose, I think also completely agree with the looking at the context and where it's been applied, and stop seeing it as one thing. It's multiple contexts, multiple power balances, and multiple impacts. And I think it was also, I love the sort of the intelligence, we even use, the word intelligence has different meanings. And so that education thing is really key. And I'm wondering if it's even more than education, but even a kind of, a regulatory check on the claims. I love that, you can toss a coin or you can use my AI solution. And, by framing it that way, you realize that, well, goodness me, that's crazy. I'm not going to start shooting people based on a coin toss. Yeah, not a very good example. But if that's being applied in that example, it's very different to, is this apple fresh or not? Or am I likely to kill someone with this car? Yeah. It's so different. Yeah. So,
thanks. Looking at the time, but I feel like I want to talk a lot more. But I want to touch on a last thing. In the Netherlands, the government asked the University of Tilburg to research deep fakes, and I was interviewed by them. And it ended with a discussion because I'm trying to reframe deep fakes to synthetic media. And they were still in the thinking that we should forbid deep fakes by law, and then companies should. This was a suggestion. Let me reframe my sentence. And then you can. So that was one area of handling it, and I was like, yeah, but you cannot, because then you're forbidding synthetic media, which is in use in every aspect of our daily life nowadays. And the other one was that you have to add a watermark to all deep fakes. And I was like, then you have to add a watermark to every picture you now make with your phone cameras. But of course, people are looking for solutions. And one of the ways is regulation. And if you look at now at how we talked about inferences becoming references, but also input for new AI systems, this loop. So, well, Lorna, you're spotlighted now. Maybe you can react as first. On my screen. maybe we can make a short ask you all, and then I'll ask you all also to end up with a giveaway, a takeaway. How do you think about regulation? What are solutions? Because the one thing is bottom-up education, awareness, and the other is top-down, trying to get a grip.
Yeah, and I think the knee-jerk reaction, we need to ban. That's that will not answer the problems. And I think it's also, as you point out, that there are cases where deepfakes might actually be needed. And it goes very similar to the discussions and the work that we're doing in identity. There are many cases where it is actually needed to have a pseudonym, to be anonymous, to have certain interactions. And it's actually, thankfully, still legally allowed, so long as you are not breaking the law.
And
I think actually
there is enough regulation already.
Well, that's the question, and I don't really want to claim to know enough to sort of say that's the answer, but it's more about the application of. And I think there's two sides. There's the claim. Is that actually a truthful claim? Is my judgment actually really reliable or not? And am I really actually being, is it the towing cost, or is it actually 99% a good assessment of the situation? That could be regulated. And the other side is the application of. Am I actually applying this in a lawful way? Again, there's a middle ground of the ethics and morality where decisions are being made where you can say, well, I didn't break the law, but actually I caused harm. So, and that's probably the pit that needs to be really looked at from the regulation point, is more harm that can be added to the regulatory framework.
Thank you. Anyone else wanting to add to this?
No, I don't know. I think, yeah, I just think this is indeed, yeah, I cannot think of anything else than thinking about what are the intentions of doing it, that you really look more to that than that you really indeed, you cannot ban these kind of things. It doesn't matter. Everything indeed is kind of filtered in a certain way. So that would be kind of impossible to live in a world that everything that you say is true.
You cannot forbid algorithms.
No, also, yeah, we also did maybe before we had this deepfake things. We also want to be able to something to not to lie always, but at least be possible to not always say the truth all the time.
Reframe the truth, indeed.
Yeah, something like that. As part of life. But what is the intention? And can you, I don't know. It's a kind of education in that sense, or like at literacy and have the ability to deal with it. But yeah, it will be a kind of a troubled times maybe for a moment, but
it's going to be
have to. Yeah.
Agnes, do you have any ideas from your field of expertise?
Yeah, let me put on my my human rights lawyer hat, because that's another thing I've done in the past. Regulation is an interesting kind of part, because we always try to over-regulate something. There's a new technology, let's regulate it. And I love that, because the law is always behind. However, I do really think that there is an opportunity here to take what I call a human rights-based approach. Because there, if we're looking at the ethics, the morality, a lot of that has been codified in universal human rights law. If we talk about the principle of non-discrimination, for example, but also privacy, if it comes to data, and some of that is now codified in Europe in the GDPR. Say, okay, it needs to be proportionate, necessary. And I've been looking at this in terms of the deepfakes, because I've been really involved in the deepfakes debate when it comes to synthetic media being abused to create deepfake pornography, right? What we call visual harm. And a lot of the jurisdiction is already there. A lot of the laws are already there. Sometimes it's a matter of just tweaking a word, that photography is no longer used, and instead imagery, for example, is used. So I think we need to hold back a little bit on over-regulating and really seeing how can we use existing frameworks to adapt. And that really can help us further. So yeah, prohibiting them, I would strongly advise against that. But there is definitely a debate necessary on how to do that. And I do think a lot of the ethics are already codified in one way or another. But I do like that do no harm principle really, in a lot of ways, is codified already.
Thank you. That also adds to what Lauren said. I really like is my conclusion reliable? And then am I implying this in a lawful way? But that then extended in a harmless way. Yeah.
Yeah, but maybe there should be more, and I really truly believe that. I think there should be more sort of testing a lot in the wild, because there's so much of these things that are just we buy this, we implement that, and then we wait until a court case comes up, right? And especially if you're the government, you can really mandate your executive to say, look, you need to test this, in the wild, quote unquote, before you make this policy. Yeah. And I think there's definitely room for improvement there.
I'll get back to you on that, because I'm organizing something with law people and scientists in this area, just to discuss these kind of things. Let me wrap up. Agnes, do you have a final takeaway that you want to share, or something you?
I think it's important to realize everyone has bias, but the machine exacerbates that if it goes unchecked. So really, we need to unlearn this idea, and that's really difficult for a generation that grew up with, you type a letter and the letter appears on the screen. That's what you know about a computer, most of us anyway. I'm not talking about the computer scientists. To unlearn that as generations, that actually the machine can get it wrong. When computer says no, it doesn't necessarily mean no. It's very difficult and requires a lot of, let's use the word education, but perhaps it should be retraining and reframing of what it can do. I think that would be my little message to take home.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Iskander.
Oh, yeah, well, I like the discussion about what is intelligence anyway, and maybe to yeah, it's not artificial intelligence, augmented intelligence is always also kind of a dialogue with what we learn indeed, and how it will what we can learn from using these technologies. So it will evolve. It's not something static also.
Super. Yeah. Mick.
Yeah, no, I think the most important takeaway for me is that that there's still a lot of debate going on, and we're not there yet to fully realize what we're getting into in a way, and we really have to be kind of more united, like what you said, right, Agnes, like more diverse teams, that we should really open up that debate a bit more, like, hey, what do people actually want, and what it could be used for, because there's a lot of useful implications of AI. And I don't know, I would maybe frame it as like, advice from your mom, like it means well, but you're like, okay, never mind, I know better anyway. So I really need to question my relationship maybe to these things, like, okay, like what do I as a person actually think of this, like, do I take the advice or not? So that's it.
Super. Yeah. I like this, thank you.
already reframing.
Yeah, it's working. Lorna.
Yeah, I mean, just again, thank you so much, Jessica, for bringing all of these issues and aspects. I mean, as I said before, I think we could have a session for an hour on each of the nuances of the challenges ahead. So I don't think it's easy to summarize, but also referring back to what Agnes was saying, it comes down to rights and human rights. And I love that. I mean, it's the regulatory discussion is we have a lot of core basic human rights covered. We have to just make sure that these technologies and these tools, they're just basically tools put into people's and organizations' hands. We have to remember that it's not the machine. Somebody in an organization has made that decision. So it's the accountability is key, and that needs to be connected. And then the ability and the rights for the individuals impacted to be able to understand and address when things go wrong. And I think that's one of the key discussions at the moment. So those individual human rights are not in place yet by any stretch of the imagination. That's probably the first thing that needs to be done, along with the framing and the regulation and all the other things. So I'll go for the human rights.
Human rights, yeah. There was so much. So thank you all from the panel. I'm really happy that you joined. Really thankful also because, well, I'm wowed. And I want to make some tweets about it. I'm thinking how I'm going to make this into a few small sentences, because I think we really touched upon a lot of essential issues. So I also want to thank you, Jessica.
Yeah, thank you.
Best for the introduction, because I know it took you a lot of preparation. You even wrote an article that we could share to prepare people. And I hope you enjoyed it yourself, this discussion. Do you have any takeaway that you want to?
You know, so many of these conversations, I think, boil down to that it takes a village, you know, and even through the lens of regulation, you know, there's the carrot and the stick. And so often we focus on the stick to try to mitigate the issue, but what are the incentives? I mean, what are the carrots and how do the incentives need to change? How does that impact business models? A lot of the kind of capital logic is behind all of this and behind what the builders discount. And it takes a village in the design of AI and diversity of perspectives. It takes a village into who has, you know, who is generating data, who can access that data, who kind of decides what benefits and harms, how do we redefine benefit? It just, this is, you know, I loved, Mick, what you said, that we need to realize we're in the first kind of inning of this and everyone has a role here. So that to me is the point. We all have a role in helping to define this for better and for worse.
Thank you. I'm so glad we recorded this because I think that so many people they already asked me, is it being recorded? Can we look at it afterwards? So thank you all. Normally we have a little present. I still do have a little. It's very small. Thank you giveaway. So I'll ask you individually if you are prepared to share an address with me, company address, so that I can send it to you. Thank you so much. I think I want to conclude the evening with this. I feel a rich girl after this. So thanks a lot. If there are not any questions anymore from other people, then I think we end it here. So feel free to go outside, enjoy the good weather. And I think your working day just has started, Jessica.
Yep. I might go outside anyway, though.
Okay, good for you. So thanks all for sharing so much time with us, and hope to see you next time. And for those based in the Netherlands or wanting to fly in September, please join us September 15th for our 10th anniversary party. It's going to be wild.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, Manon.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks
Thanks.
all.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Ciao.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I'll end the record.